Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zakarin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Erich Hatala Matthes, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Advisory Faculty for Environmental Studies at Wellesley College. We're discussing his Oxford University Press book, What to Save and Why: Identity, Authenticity, and the Ethics of Conservation. Erich's book explores the idea of conservation, the practice of preserving things for posterity and fighting against the tides of entropy. What we choose to save can range from famous paintings and natural landscapes to Marilyn Monroe's dress and endangered species. Depending on your personal concerns, what we save, how we should save it, and why differs for everyone. This philosophical investigation will make you think deeply about what matters and what should be saved. Erich, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, this book was really interesting and I think got me thinking about a topic that, I have to say I don't think about enough. I love nature, and I always when I hear the word conservation, I immediately think about nature conservation.
Sure.
So that's certainly what I think about in terms of. But I think you do a really good job of connecting all of the different things we might conserve. Like Marilyn Monroe's dress, for example, or a recipe or a piece of Roman pottery. So I think you ask a lot of really interesting questions, and ones that I realized as you were asking them that I had not really come up with answers for. So it was interesting to see how you reasoned in relation to those questions. So before talking about the book and talking about conservation, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so I've been a philosophy professor at Wellesley for 12 years. I grew up in central New Jersey, and I've always been sort of interested in ideas and thinking about ideas in different ways. I majored in English and philosophy in college, and then did a PhD in philosophy. And one of the things I really valued about writing this book was that it was an opportunity to come back to some things that I've been thinking about off and on for a long time. So my dissertation was about historical value, and one of the chapters of that dissertation was about this question about preservation. It was actually the first chapter that I wrote for my dissertation. So I was like taking a stab at this, 15 years ago in my mid-20s. And that was work that I actually never published because I find it's a really difficult question. So it was great to have the opportunity to sort of come back to these questions that I've been thinking about for a long time and try to get at them in a way that I thought would help other people with the process of thinking through them as well. Because, as you know from having read the book, while I definitely make some arguments about, things, ways that I think it would be productive and helpful for us to think about conservation, a lot of the book is also aimed to be a kind of guide to help anybody think through conservation questions for themselves, because there's a lot of this that's going to be highly contextual and personal. And so the book kind of aims to provide a framework for thinking about what to save and why. The what to save and why is like an invitation for the reader to reflect. It's not a list. It's not like save these things and here's why. And so yeah, it was really a fun opportunity to do that work and get back to these questions that have been with me for a while.
Can you talk about the actual process of writing the book? How did you think about how you wanted to structure it, and what was your kind of research approach like?
Yeah. Great question. The structure of the book was something that I played with a lot. There were points at which I thought I wanted to structure it around different kinds of conservation contexts, so a chapter about nature conservation and art conservation and conserving mementos and things like that. But the more time I spent with the topic, the more I felt like the questions that I wanted to ask were ones that cut across lots of different contexts. And indeed, I think that's one of the things that is hopefully unique about this book that I think a philosophical perspective brings to it, is that I don't have the expertise of a practitioner who focuses on biodiversity conservation or fine art conservation. What I do have are sort of a set of skills and resources and breadth of reading that allows me to take a kind of a 30,000 foot view and see some ways in which all of these different pieces from lots of disparate contexts of conservation might fit together. And so what I ultimately decided to do in structuring the book is to structure it around these 6 conservation questions. So each chapter focuses on a particular question. So those are sort of what should we save? Why should we save things? From what should we save them? How should we save them? By whom should they be saved? And for whom should they should be saved? And so I think those are 6 really fundamental questions that arise in any kind of context in which we might be thinking about conservation, whether we're thinking about environmental conservation or art conservation, or thinking about, what knickknacks to save in our attic. And so that really drove the way that I thought about structuring the book. And then from a sort of a research perspective, like I was mentioning before, I tried to read really widely. It's one of the things that's always drawn me to philosophy as a discipline is that, and it's not, I don't think philosophy is the only discipline where this is the case, but I think philosophy in particular values this kind of breadth of inquiry, right? It's like all kinds of work is philosophically relevant and useful and generative. And so I think in philosophy, at least when done properly, in my view, there's this invitation to sort of explore a topic as broadly as you can. And so when I was doing research for this book, as I mentioned, I've been doing it in a way for over a decade. I really tried to read really broadly. So see what people are saying in environmental conservation, see what they're saying in art conservation, also see what people are saying in really esoteric conservation fields. So articles, there's an article that comes up in the book about, the preservation of classic Mustangs. It's like, I'm not a car guy. I don't know anything about Mustangs, but it's fascinating to see, what you can learn from people who really take seriously some particularly niche kind of conservation, and then trying to sort of take that and see what we can pull out of it and apply to other kinds of contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that was what I found interesting about the book, was that I had really thought of conservation. I mean, I suppose I had thought of, I'm a book, maybe unsurprisingly, I collect some red books. So I think a little bit about the conservation of books, but it really is incredible how many things can fall under that general rubric of conservation. And you've also, with the way you've structured the book, you've kind of inadvertently made it the job, or maybe this is intentional, made it the job of an interviewer quite easy, because you've kind of written the questions that I could ask.
Yeah, what should we save? Right. That's the first question.
Yes. Yeah.
And I guess just before we dive into more questions, one thing that I was thinking about based on what you were just saying, and earlier when you're saying, oh, I'm not sure I had thought as much about conservation as I want to. I mean, I think that's also one of the things that I wanted to communicate with this book. And it's part of the reason why the title is about saving things as opposed to conservation or preservation, because conservation often feels technical, right? But the issue at the heart of this book is not primarily a technical issue. It's about keeping stuff, saving stuff. And we all care about keeping things and saving things. We might care about saving different things. And that's, a big part of the discussion as well. But that's a really fundamental human concern that we shouldn't relegate to the realm of technical expertise. It's something that I think we all care about and should all be thinking about.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I sort of jumping into the book, because I want to get into these questions that you ask and the topics that you explore. Just at a very, very high level, why do we seek to conserve things? Can you help situate our thinking on this topic with maybe some examples that you look at in the book?
Yeah. So why conserve things? There's a number of different things that we might think about saving when we say, well, why should we save things, or what should we save? And there are some sort of common candidates that come up, right? So sometimes it's, well, we should save this particular material object, right? Or we should save authentic things, or we should save the memory of things, or the particular history that they have. So there are sort of natural candidates that come up when we tend to think about conservation. And often what unites the different sorts of things that we're motivated to conserve is the worry that they're going to be lost, right? So conservation often arises in the context of this threat of loss. Oftentimes we don't even think about, the importance of saving things until something's threatened, right? Until we're worried about whether or not we're going to be able to keep it. And so because of the role that sort of threat of loss plays, we tend to think about conserving things that are particularly rare, things that might be irreplaceable, things where their value can't be reproduced by something else. And so that's part of what drives a lot of conservation interest towards things like the environment or species or exemplary works of artwork, because we know that if we don't save these things, then we're not going to be able to recreate them, right? They're going to be lost in an irrevocable sort of way. But I think it's worth noting that although a lot of our, intuitive thinking about conservation trends towards those kind of, world historical value kind of things, the same kind of worries arise in really intimate contexts. So you might have, a really important keepsake, for example, that doesn't matter to anybody besides you. But the same kind of worries might motivate your concern with keeping it or saving it, with the thought that if you lose it, then there's nothing else that's going to be the same or, be meaningful to you in the particular way that that thing is meaningful.
Absolutely. I think what you said about this notion that we don't think about conservation until something's threatened. I have a really silly example, but yesterday I was grocery shopping and I was debating whether or not to buy, I love hot sauce, and I was debating, should I just buy the large bottle of hot sauce or should I buy a smaller bottle of hot sauce? And I ended up picking the smaller one because I thought, if I buy the large one, then I'm just going to, think that I'm, swimming in hot sauce, and I'll use it too fast and then it will disappear. Where if I have a smaller one, then I will conserve it more off the bat. So that's a silly example, but definitely, with the book, it, got me thinking about that. So, grocery store moment. But you talk about, and I think this is kind of with your last example of, an individual thing, but this kind of relationship between conservation and identity. Obviously, there's conservation and individual identity, but then conservation and group identity. So can you talk about this relationship?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm trying to tease out in the book is that although our focus when we're thinking about saving things often, falls on particular objects or practices or places, often what's lurking in the background and can become more explicit in certain contexts is the idea that by saving these particular things, we're also going to be saving something about our identity, something about our sense of self. And so the basic idea is pretty simple. The thought is that when we think about who we are, right, just sort of in a broad sense, like a description of yourself that matters to you, right? So, doesn't have to be like the identity of identity politics, although it can include that kind of identity. But just like, you identify as a book lover who likes hot sauce, right? Like that kind of identity is what I have in mind, right? Just sort of like really sort of like basic, like things that you value about yourself, right? Important aspects of how we identify in that sense are constituted by the things that we care about and the things that we care for. So that if you are a book lover who is into hot sauce, right, it's going to matter to you that there be books available to engage with, that there be hot sauce available to consume. So that's the sense in which questions about saving things get sort of inextricably bound up with our sense of self or our identity. Because if we don't, try to save the things that make up who we are, then we're threatened with the loss of who we are in some sense, right? Not like complete loss of identity, right? But like a loss of identity, at least in those respects that relate to the things that we care about. And so, sometimes you see this coming up in really dramatic ways in debates about conservation that can be surprising, but that also, I think, give us a really helpful context for understanding why people sometimes get so invested in saving things. So one of the examples that I talk about in the book that sort of straddles the individual and collective context that you were asking about is I used to live in Natick, Massachusetts, right next door to Wellesley College. And there's like this little kind of, pretty dam spillway on the Charles River there. And there's been an effort to destroy the dam because it's not great from an environmental perspective. It needs, significant and costly work if it were to be maintained. Right. So there are, various like town council committee actions, right, have been, working towards doing these assessments about whether we should keep the dam and, recommending we should get rid of it. Right. So, but then there were all these people in the town who were like, no, save the dam, right? We got to save the dam. And what was interesting about it was that the way in which those campaigns often were situated were about the preservation of town identity. They were like, this dam is part of who we are. It's what makes us unique, right? Who would we be without this dam? And what really struck me, this was one of those like serendipitous research experiences. I was talking with the sustainability director for the town, and she was like, "Have you seen this article about saving dams, in general?" And I was like, "No. What do you like? Tell me about it." She sent me this article. The title of the article was something like, "If you kill the dam, you're killing me." So it was like not even particular to this little town, right? That there was this context in which identity was so bound up with a dam, right? It's like a general phenomenon of like people getting attached to dams and thinking about aspects of collective identity in these little New England towns, right? Which is itself kind of remarkable, right? And so I think the lesson there is not, oh well, because people's identity is bound up with this dam, you've got to save it or something like that, right? It's not so simple. Sometimes our identity is something that we need to rethink or reevaluate or allow to change, right? So identity is not supposed to be some kind of like trump card in thinking about conservation. But I think it also provides this really helpful perspective for understanding why sometimes people get so invested in these issues, right? So like, because at first, as somebody who, I didn't grow up in the town, I just lived there because I work nearby, I was kind of like, what is up with these people who are so obsessed with this dam? It's like just this little dam. It's not that big a deal. But if you can see where they're coming from, the way in which they're thinking about the dam as an essential part of what it means to sort of belong to this town, sort of reframes the question a little bit. And I think that can then guide how we move forward, right? Again, it doesn't mean save the dam. It seems like there might be lots of good reasons to get rid of the dam in this particular case. But when you recognize the role that it plays for people, that's going to shape how you talk to them about it, right? How you approach the discussion about perhaps, letting it go and sort of changing the way in that place looks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really interesting example. And I think those sorts of things, I understand that maybe not that particular example, but like in my local hometown, there's this great, there's this diner, and the the owner died, and then it got replaced, and it was like my first. It was my first like experience of depression for some reason. Like I was like 6 years old, and this diner was so important to my sense of my local town, and it disappearing felt like it felt horrible at the time, and I remember it right. Like I remember it really clearly. So it certainly is interesting how things that we can get attached to certain places and things that maybe don't necessarily fit into the categories that we immediately think of when we think of conservation.
Right.
When thinking about this, can you talk a little about the sense of there being a moral imperative to save certain things? Like obviously there's the emotional aspect of it that you highlighted, but more broadly, which objects or environments, really demand our attention that kind of bring out this moral, ethical imperative to save certain things like cultures, environments, etc.
Yeah, I think that the moral dimensions of conservation can come out in a number of different ways, right? So sometimes, for example, in more intimate contexts, saving things can be a part of what we owe to other people who we care about. So, sometimes when people are distraught over whether or not they can save things that were left to them by their parents or grandparents, for example, they think about things in terms of, well, I owe it to them to save this thing because it mattered to them, right? So sometimes the moral valence of preservation comes from this sense of like obligation to other individuals who you care about. Sometimes it can even come from a sense of an obligation to yourself, right? Like you owe it to yourself to save things related to what we were talking about before because it is an important part of your identity and you think that is important. And sometimes, there are these morally important obligations we have to ourselves. And then in sort of some, broader scale contexts, sometimes it can be particularly morally important to save things because of the nature of the threats to those things, right? So like why have they been threatened, right? So sometimes things are threatened by, random occurrences, sort of like natural disasters, things like that. Sort of putting aside for the moment the way that climate change can influence natural disasters, right? But then like other things are threatened by, right, particular human actions that have a certain moral character to them. So if you think about, for example, the way that certain cultures and cultural practices and traditions and objects were, stamped out or threatened through practices of colonialism or imperialism, right? Then you might think that those are cases where, because of the character of the threat, there's this extra moral reason to preserve the thing that was threatened, or to at least facilitate the preservation or the recovery of that particular thing, because it means something different now to save it, right? It's not just a matter of saving it from loss. Saving it in this case is also an act of resistance against, a certain form of oppression, for example. And so that's just one case that has that kind of character to it. And you can think of other cases where, like, the nature of the threat, right, or the reason why something is threatened might then give us extra reason to try to save it, or to think about saving it in a different way.
Yeah, no, that sort of that goes a little bit into my next question, which is just this kind of general, when we think about conservation, oftentimes it's trying to protect against, entropy, decay, disrepair, things that kind of just natural change.
Right.
There is a sense, as you put it, all loss is change, but not all change is loss. That was, what you were getting into with
Right.
some of these types of maybe forced change that isn't natural. I guess, like, how should we sort of think about, like, the type of change that might be maybe acceptable? Like, this is just something taking its natural course of events versus this type of bad change.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is like a fundamental question I think sits at the heart of the book, as we're thinking about change and what kinds of change we should be responding to when it comes to conservation, and how, right? So, like, one kind of like straightforward way of thinking about conservation, like you were suggesting, is just it's the attempt to stop things from changing, right? It's like this very sort of conservative notion of conservation, right? It's like no change, right? Don't allow any change. Keep things exactly the way they are, right? And there are, some like historical precedents for thinking about conservation, even of, things like art and the environment and stuff, in that particular way. In, the evolution of various conservation fields, I think there's been a shift to thinking about things not so much in terms of arresting all change, but rather in terms of the management of change. That's a phrase that comes up in lots of different, particular technical conservation fields. Like, conservation is about managing change, trying to recognize that, like, some changes are inevitable, right? Some changes we don't necessarily want to stop from happening, but we want to be able to, control them in some way, manage them. And I think there's something to that idea. But I think, sort of moving even past that, one of the sort of central notions that I try to develop in the book is that conservation is also about managing the terms on which we experience change. And so it's not just about managing change itself, right? But managing our relationship to those changes, right? What kind of agency do we have? What kind of power might we exert over those changes? What kinds of attitudes can we adopt towards those changes through our conservation practices that can change our relationship with that change, right? And thus, sometimes make those kinds of changes, especially when they're inevitable, more palatable to us, right? To experience those changes in a way that doesn't feel like some sort of like external dominating force taking something away from us or destroying something we care about, right? But even in contexts where we can't stop the change, right? Just reorienting us to the change in a way that can allow us to come to terms with it. So there's this Questlove, who most people know as the drummer for The Roots, but is also just, a filmmaker and writer and all-around thoughtful guy, has this great essay about collecting in the New York Times. And so, in the book, I use a quote from this to sort of illustrate this idea. So he's talking about collecting. He writes, "A collection starts as a protest against the passage of time and ends as a celebration of it." And I thought, that's such a great illustration of this idea I was talking about, right? So, like, things things are changing, right? Time's going by, trends are changing. And so you start collecting stuff, right? Maybe you collect Pez dispensers or, graphic novels or whatever it is, right? You like collect things as a protest against the fact that like times are changing, right? But like you can't stop the passage of time, right? You're not stopping those changes, right? So ultimately, this active collection reorients your thinking about the passage of time, right? Because the passage of time doesn't just make you lose those things. It also helps make those things special, right? Because they're, for example, less common, right? Or the changing context makes them valuable in a different way. And so this practice of collecting allows you to shift, right, from a protest against the passage of time to a celebration of it, right? And I think that's what's so great about the quote, right? It's like you're not just celebrating the things, you're celebrating now the passage of time, the thing that you were originally protesting against. And I think that's just sort of a great illustration of this broader idea that I'm trying to develop in the center of the book about ways in which we can change the terms on which change itself is experienced.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I think it's a great quote. In terms of conservation, I think, for like Questlove, like he has a huge record collection, and
Yeah.
to a certain extent, like collecting records, a person might ask like, oh well, there's no point in collecting records because you can just have it digitally preserved, and obviously like digital preservation, puts a kind of or adds a kind of interesting aspect to how we might debate conservation, because there's certain things that we might say are digitally preserved that are acceptable. For example, the digital preservation of a book, that's the book. It doesn't matter if you don't have the original copy that was published, the original manuscript. If you have the digital version of the book, it's the same as the book. But is a picture of the Mona Lisa the same as the painting itself, or a picture of the dodo bird good enough? So yeah, can you kind of walk us through that, how we should conserve things, what is acceptable forms of conservation, and, what things really can't be preserved digitally?
Yeah, Grace. So I talk quite a bit about digital preservation in the book because I think it's a really tricky issue that requires a lot of contextual thinking. So I think that you tend to see people who are, real advocates of digital preservation, just want to digitize everything and think about that as like, that's it, done, right? We saved it, digitized. So you see this coming up sometimes in rhetoric around saving cultural heritage sites that are threatened by war or by climate change, right? There are certain projects to digitize them. And I don't think the practitioners of these digital projects tend to have this view. I hasten to say, but I think some of the media response around them tends to have this view. It's like, oh, well, now they're digitized, they're saved, right? Nothing can harm them now. But as you know, sort of having a digital record of a place is really different from preserving that place, or having a digital or like scan of a piece of architecture is really different from being able to visit a site where it was constructed, to move around it, and so I think we need to be careful about how much we emphasize what we gain from digital preservation. There are some contexts in which digital preservation does something for us, but we need to be careful about thinking of it as a replacement for the thing in question, which I think sometimes this rhetoric can flirt with, right? It's like thinking about, oh, we digitized it, that's a replacement for the original. Often not, right? But that's not to say that the digital preservation work isn't really important. It can offer us, unique ways to sort of facilitate our interactions with those places. It can allow people who would never be able to visit them to experience them in different ways. It can be really exciting. You can think about, sort of increasing technological advances that allow people through virtual reality to sort of navigate a place that they would never get to experience firsthand. I'm not at all opposed to that stuff. I think that's really cool, and it can allow people really exciting ways of engaging with these otherwise inaccessible things. I think the danger is thinking that that's somehow a replacement for the thing that that it's a scan of, right, or it's a representation of. And so sometimes it's like the preservation term itself feels misleading, right? To talk about that as digital preservation seems to be the mistake, right? It's like digital access. It's digital, accompaniment. It's something else, right? But it's not really preservation, and so that can be sometimes misleading. There There's also, I think, sometimes the thought that like, well, once we've digitized something, it's impervious to destruction because digital preservation is like somehow more secure than, analog preservation. But that's also like really misleading, right? It's actually quite hard to preserve things digitally, partially because technology is changing all the time. And when you think about being able to access things that you've preserved digitally, for example, all kinds of technological barriers come up. And so, I've read things about this recently in context of video game preservation, for example, sort of preserving old video games. You need to be able to, play the game in order to really have preserved it. And because of technological changes, it can actually require a lot of, advanced technological work to be able to sort of like port those games in a way that they are playable in a manner that is appropriate to the game, right? So if it's like an arcade game, like how do you experience what it was like to play that game? It seems like, well, you're going to need some sort of like arcade system that lets you, experience it in a similar way. So, sometimes when we think about digital preservation, we might think about it as, very secure, but it's actually digital media is itself, subject to all kinds of forms of loss. So that's like another danger I think we need to navigate in thinking about digital preservation.
You also look at, the responsibility to preserve certain things falls on. So for example, like in the example of the town that you used to live in with the dam, it might be the case that the people there that were very passionate about defending that dam, they might not care about a dam in another city. Maybe there is someone that, they just want, they're dam preserving dams is their focus, but in all likelihood, it had to do with preserving the character of the town. So they might not care about one in Arizona as much as they did in their neck of the woods. So Mike, I think the question is, who should save what? How should other people or other cultures think about the preservation of, for example, a piece of Roman pottery that should a person in a completely different part of the world at a completely different time care about preserving, cultures that have since passed, languages that have since passed, things that might have been important to one group of people, but since maybe not so much.
Yeah. Complicated question. So on the one hand, I think that it makes a lot of sense and is, generally good for people to care about valuable things from all over the world, from all kinds of times, from all kinds of different contexts. So it's just sort of like perhaps somewhat controversial. This is like the aspect of the universal museum ideal that I like, and I think we should be positively disposed to, right? The idea that the, history and diversity of human culture is fascinating, and we should all be interested in that stuff, like all of it, right? That's not to say that you yourself have to be interested in every single thing, right? But like all of that stuff is worth caring about and worth being interested in. And I think that that's a really important ideal that I don't want to lose. The sense that like, because something is, very foreign to me in time and place, that I shouldn't be interested in it, I think is a really sort of dangerous and limiting idea. That being said, the Universal Museum is fraught with all kinds of moral problems because the idea of the Universal Museum has often involved taking that good idea, I think, that we should all be interested in, the diversity of world cultures, and turning it into a kind of like entitlement, right, to ownership and to control. I think that's where the ideal sort of loses its footing. So what I want to do is sort of like walk this fine line between saying there are lots of reasons why people should care about valuable things from beyond their own cultural context. But that doesn't mean that they should then try to assert control over the preservation of those things. Sometimes, and it depends on the context, but sometimes, right, it's really important for the people who are most intimately associated with a particular thing or a cultural practice or object to be the ones who are taking the lead in shaping its preservation, because of the issues that I was talking about earlier about the link between preservation and identity, right? I might be really interested in, some particular aspect of, Japanese culture, for example, right? But it's not part of my identity, right? It's just like something that I'm interested in, right? Whereas others who are differently positioned in relation to that thing, it might be core to their sense of self. And so the role that they might play in leading conservation of it, in participating in the saving of it, can then also be a way of, preserving their sense of self, right? Like it's part of the way in which we sort of maintain who we are. And so I think that the participatory role in conservation can itself be really, really crucial. And this comes up, unfortunately, in, the most stark ways when it's absent, right? So like when you have, for example, right, like colonial powers who then, play the primary role in the preservation of the very cultures that they, were responsible for stamping out and oppressing, right? And so those are cases where you get, really stark, understanding of the way in which, the very control of preservation by the forces that threaten something in the first place is itself a kind of like further affront to those things. And so it can be especially important, say, in the context of like indigenous cultures for, the particular indigenous communities who were, subject to those forms of, cultural oppression to have, opportunities to exercise their own agency in preserving those things, because that's, of course, part of what makes them valuable, not just to people in general, but to those particular communities.
As far as who we should save things for, who should we think about when we think about conservation? Should we think about our future selves, future generations, aliens? What are the, the groups or people that we should really think about saving things for?
Yeah. I mean, I think we should think about it pluralistically. I think that there are lots of good answers to the question about who we should save things for. We do need to think about trade-offs in that regard. So, if we're saving things for the distant future, the methods that we would need in order to do that might preclude people 10 years from now from accessing those things. And we do that sometimes, right? We, bury time capsules. We, make time capsules in the sort of vague idea that maybe other forms of intelligence will find them at some point in time. And I have no problem with that. I think that's sort of an attractive aspiration in some ways. But I think that one of the things that we do in saving things, sort of tying in with what I was saying before about conservation as an opportunity to manage the terms in which change is experienced, is one of the things that we do in saving things for the future is that we allow people in the future, whether it's 10 years from now or 100 years from now, to themselves make choices about what they want to continue saving or what they want to continue to engage with, right? So, sometimes you get this kind of like skeptical idea that like, oh, like why is it worth saving these things if people in the future don't care about it? And I'm not really convinced by that kind of skepticism. Like, I don't think I don't think we have to assume that it's the case that everybody in the future is going to care about the exact same things that we care about in order to make them worth preserving. Because by preserving them, we at least give them the opportunity, right? We like put it on the table as an option. Like, here's a thing that you might care about. We thought this was important. You might think so too. And maybe they won't, right? And that's fine. But I don't think the fact that they, people in the future don't care about something undermines the point of saving it, because we've given them that option. We've secured the opportunity for them to think about whether it's something worth saving. I think that itself is quite important.
So I guess to sort of summarize your argument, can you get just maybe probably can't do it in one sentence, but kind of just give an overview of really how you want people to think about conservation and its significance, as opposed to maybe how they might have been thinking about it before, like how I was only really in the context of nature.
Yeah, I think my main takeaway is to not think about conservation as some sort of niche interest that you can always just offload to experts, right? To think about it as perhaps surprisingly sometimes, but bound up with important aspects of who you are, right? Especially when you take it outside of the context of interests like fine arts or environmental preservation, right? Like, say you're a football fan or whatever, right? Like, an important part of being a football fan is going to be securing the future of football, right? I mean, maybe there are moral objections to that. That's an interesting question, right? But the thought is that like saving things is something that we all should care about because it impacts all of us, right? We all have an identity. We all have a way of thinking about ourselves that is constituted by the things that we care about. And so if, we want to sort of hang on to that sense of self, then we're going to need to save those things that we care about. On the other hand, sometimes we're going to find that aspects of our identity require rethinking, require change. And so sometimes it's going to be the case that allowing things to change, not conserving things, is going to be part of the way in which we change our understanding of who we are, sometimes in productive senses. So ultimately, I think, in addition to the link between conservation and identity, the idea that conserving things isn't just about stopping change, isn't just about even managing change, but about managing the terms on which that change is experienced, finding ways of orienting ourselves to changes, even changes that we can't prevent, that can allow us to, endorse those changes, or perhaps just sort of reconcile us to those changes. That's an important part of conservation too. And I think that, adopting that attitude can really be helpful in navigating the frailty of things in our lives, right? Especially when we confront things that we just can't save.
Yeah. I think it's, you've certainly, given me a lot to think about. I'm sure given listeners as well. I think this is a really fascinating book, and I think you do a good job of just outlining the arguments in a really clear way. So thank you so much for being a guest on the New Books Network, Erich. It was really wonderful to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah, I'll just repeat that the book is What to Save and Why: Identity, Authenticity, and Ethics of Conversation. Thanks so much.